truth. Well, I'm Pastor Ben, and it is my privilege this morning to be back with you and sharing God's word. But as we do that, I want to bring up 3 specific topics that will probably make you a little uncomfortable. The first one is religion, the second one is money, and the third one is politics. Now, we all know that these are 3 things we are not supposed to mention in polite company, because if we do that, that company might not be polite anymore. And the reason that we're told not to do that is because people are passionate about these topics, right? They're passionate about their religion. They're passionate about their money. They're passionate about their politics. And because they're passionate about it, they have strong opinions. And so to bring up one of these topics might unintentionally create a lot of conflict. And your mom told you, your dad told you, or someone told you along the way, don't do this because it's going to create turmoil. Now, me personally, I generally try to avoid conflict. So I try not to bring up these topics too much, or at least bring them up in appropriate manners as best I can. But here's the problem as Christians. Here's the problem as Christ followers. Here's the problem as a pastor and as a church. We have to talk about these things because Jesus spoke about these things. Now, obviously, he spoke about religion. That's an obvious one, right? And he spoke quite a bit about money, but he also spoke about politics as well. And so when we follow Christ, we have to have conversations like this. Now, like I said, the first one is an obvious one, right? That's a gimme. To talk about religion in church is obviously what we should be doing. That's the whole point. In fact, if you joined us online today, you walked into a church service intentionally. You expect us to talk about God. You expect us to talk about Jesus. In fact, maybe that's your primary motivation, because right now, maybe you're joining us for the first time. You came here, you're watching online because life right now is so uncertain, right? It's so uncertain. And you just want something certain. And so you came to join us this morning. Or maybe right now, you feel like you don't even know what truth is anymore. What you thought you knew isn't true anymore, at least that's what people are telling you. And there's just so much turmoil in the world. You just want something consistent. You want a truth that doesn't change. And if that's what's driving you this morning, you have come to the exact right place. Because we're going to talk about a God who's eternal, a God who never changes, a God whose truth is always the same, and what he penned in Scripture does not need to be adapted. It is eternal truth from an eternal God who eternally loves you. And so if that's why you came here, you have come to the right place. Keep coming back, keep connecting, and keep experiencing the transformation that only God has provided. And if that's you, I am so glad that you're here this morning. Well, 2 weeks ago, we had that cringeworthy topic of money that we went over, right? And so the reason we talked about money is not because we're at a deficit as a church, because that's not true. And we talked about it not because I love talking about money, because that's definitely not true. The reason we talked about money, like I said before, is because Jesus spoke about money. In fact, he spoke about money quite often, which is why sometimes people, when they look at pastors or they look at the church or they look at Jesus, they think, wasn't Jesus just a money grabber? Right? Wasn't that what he was about? He was about getting my money, right? They're just trying to get my money. But that's far from true. Because Jesus wasn't a money grabber, as if he actually needs your money, right? He owns everything. He doesn't need your money, but what he does want is your heart. And this is what he knows, and this is what you know if you're honest, is that your wallet, your bank account, your money, it's intimately connected with your heart. In fact, it's a great barometer to look at how you spend your money to know exactly what you are passionate about. And Jesus, he has these conversations because he loves you and he wants to have a real relationship with you. And so he doesn't want your money, but he does want your heart, and he knows those two are connected so intimately. Well, today we're going to move on to the third topic. We're going to talk about politics, right? The third thing we're not supposed to talk about in polite company, we're going to talk about it here. But before we do that, I think it's so important to understand, how did we even get here in this sermon series? You see, we started this summer sermon series called Unmasked, and we've had a central theme through the whole thing. It was a conversation between Jesus and his disciples. And what he said to his disciples and what he ultimately said to us is that people will know you are followers of Christ, they will know you are Christians by your love for one another. Which means the definition of Christian should be love. How the world should see us is loving. So if I were to ask you out for a cup of coffee, right, and we were having an incredibly candid conversation about something like politics, you might say, if you were feeling comfortable or if you're feeling overly honest or if you weren't scared of judgment, you might say to me, look, when it comes to voting time, I always vote for the Democratic option. I always do. And the reason I do is because I believe that's the most loving platform. You might say something like that. But if I took out somebody else from our same church, right, who has the same belief system that you do as far as Jesus, if I took them out and I asked them the same question, who do you vote for? And if they were honest, they might say, look, I always vote for the Republican option. Because I believe in the long term, that is the most loving option. And so I always vote Republican. And both of you would have probably incredibly valid points to why you vote in that direction. But can we just be honest? If we take account of how politics are run in our nation, I don't think loving would be the word, right? There's so much division, there's so much fighting, there's so much war, if you will, going on. So loving probably isn't the term. And that's why back in March, when this whole crisis started, when COVID-19 started being every headline we could ever read, that for a brief moment, there was a brief moment where I experienced something that I don't experience a lot as an adult, maybe have only experienced one other time in my adult life, that the two sides of the coin, right and left, red and blue, Democrat and Republican, they got on the same page. Right? Our goal was to flatten the curve. Our goal was to stop the virus, and we were all unified. The president, the governors, everyone for a brief moment was unified. And that lasted, as we know, for about 36 hours. And then what happened, the normal thing that happens, is one side picks a corner they're going to live in, and the other side automatically runs to the farthest point from them, right? That's the reality of our politics. There's not a lot of unity. And we crave unity. We want unity. And that's where Jesus steps in. Because Jesus, he's the great unifier, especially when it comes to believers in him. Because this is what Jesus teaches. This is what the Bible teaches us. That it's not about red and it's not about blue. It's always about gold. It's always about Christ sitting on his throne and Christ sitting on the throne of our hearts. So in the book of Matthew today, we're going to look at this great unifier's words. And this is how he begins. Do not think that I have come to bring peace to the earth. I have not come to bring peace, but a sword. Now, right now you're thinking, Ben, didn't you just say that he was the great unifier? These words don't sound that unifying. But to really understand what Christ is saying to his disciples, we actually have to back up a little bit in this chapter at the very beginning and understand why he's saying these words to them. You see, what he's doing is he's preparing his disciples to go out and be apostles, right? Messengers. They're going to carry the mission forward when he's gone. They don't know that yet, but he's preparing them for that. And he gives them these amazing promises. When you go out, you're going to heal diseases, you're going to help the afflicted, and you're going to cast out demons. Right? Those are some amazing promises. That's some amazingly good news. And you know what the disciples thought when they heard this? People are going to love us. Right? Everyone's going to love us because if we bring this to the table, if we can bring this into their life, who's not going to want this? But this is what Jesus knows, and this is what you've experienced in life, is that good news is dependent on the hearer. Right? What you bring as good news might not be received as good news. Think about it. Remember that time when you had that friend, you had that family member who had too much to drink, and you went up to them and said, hey, I love you. I got to take your keys. Right? That's good news. I can drive you home. You can stay safe. I'll get you a cab, right? That's good news. But remember when they didn't receive it well? And what you thought was good news quickly turned into a war? How about this? You have that person in your life, and they've been caught up in the drug scene, right? They're abusing drugs. And so you do something loving for them. You go into their house, you take out all the drugs, right? You sweep the house, you raid the house, you get it all out of there, you destroy it. And then you tell them the good news. I love you too much to let you train wreck your life. And so I've removed all the drugs out of your house. How do you think they'd respond? Well, it depends. But I'd say a lot of times, not very well, right? A war will quickly ensue because good news depends on the hearer. How about something maybe a little bit more practical to your life? How about when you share something loving with somebody who knows that you love them? You say, look, you need to eat healthier. You need to sleep more. You need to maybe give up that smoking habit because these things aren't healthy for you, and I want the best for you. Remember how that didn't quite work out the way you intended? You remember how maybe there was a little bit of an edge to that conversation, a little bit of a tension to that conversation, maybe even some words that felt war-like in that conversation? You see, the good news is always dependent on the hearer. And those disciples had good news. They were going to do amazing things, and ultimately the most important thing they were going to do is tell people this amazing story that the God of the universe, that Jesus Christ came to connect with them in a real personal way. The King of the world who sits on the throne wanted to sit on the throne of their hearts and offer them hope and a future and transformation and freedom. That's the good news. But Jesus wanted them to know that not everyone was going to receive that as good news. And so he goes on. For I have come to set a man against his father and a daughter against her mother. Now, when Jesus said these words, you could just feel the tension in the room because before they kind of got that. Right? What Jesus said before, they understood that there's people who might not receive the good news and people pick sides, and that's what happens, right? We call that in our nation, we call that politics, right? Nation versus nation, right versus left, red versus blue, right? We get all of those things. Whatever we think is right, the other person must be wrong, and so we run to our sides. And when we run to our sides, obviously the other person automatically becomes the enemy. And that makes sense. But Jesus, now we're talking about our family. All right, these are the people that are supposed to have everything in common with us. We look the same. We sound the same. We have a similar sense of humor, right? We have similar values because that's how Mama raised us, right? Mom and Dad, they raise us to be exactly like them for better or worse, and we become like them. So at home, there shouldn't be as much tension. At home, we should have so much commonality. But here's the thing. When Jesus, who's sitting on his throne, sits on the throne of our hearts, that means that he begins to influence us. And he might raise us a little different than our parents raised us. And we start going in that direction, how God wants us to go, it might actually create some conflict because some of those commonalities that we used to have with our family, they might be gone. You see, this is a tough teaching, and this is a heavy conversation for these disciples. And so Jesus, he wants to kind of lighten the mood, and so he goes on to say this, and a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. And I think, I wasn't there, but my thinking is this. When Jesus says this part of the conversation, he just kind of sits there, straight-faced, for a little bit. The disciples don't know what to do with this statement. And then he kind of smirks. And they all start laughing. Because that's the truth, right? There's always this conversation we're having about how in-laws, we can't get along with our in-laws, and there's always that tension. And of course there's tension, right? Because think about what's happened. You have stolen their baby from them, right? Your husband was their baby boy at one point in time. Your wife was their little daughter at one point in time, and they loved them, and you stole them, right? You stole them. And then, here's what's worse. You stole their seat of influence. right? Now you're their number one influencer in life. And that's obviously very, very hard. So I can just see the disciples. They're sitting there, they're laughing, they're sharing their mother-in-law stories if they have a mother-in-law, or they're sharing other stories they've heard from other people, right? And they're just laughing, they're having a good time. And then finally, Jesus kind of quiets the moment because it's time to move on. It's time to get serious again. And this is what he says next. And one's foes will be members of one's own household. Once again, he starts talking about the family, right? The people who have had your back in everything. And what he's saying is, look, these people who have had your back in absolutely everything, in this regard, they might not have your back. Because as soon as you take them off the throne, right, as soon as you take them off the seat of influence and put Jesus in that spot, it very likely can create some tension. And then Jesus, he gets really specific. This is what he says next. Whoever loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. He gets so specific. He talks about our mom and our dad, right? The people that we are genetically engineered to love. Right? These are the people who raised us, who birthed us, who brought us into the world. These people, they're so important, and we love them dearly. But have you ever gotten in a relationship? Have you ever been married or had a boyfriend or girlfriend, and they didn't quite get along with your parents, and you were caught in the middle? You were caught in the middle of two groups of people that you loved dearly, and it was so horrible. It was such a bad experience. Because this group didn't like that group, and you loved both groups, and you were trying to mediate and get it to work. That's the tension that Jesus wants us to feel. The tension of our parents, but instead of a boyfriend or girlfriend or spouse, the tension of Jesus, right, the King. And so Jesus goes on to say, hey, look, this is what he's explaining. He's saying, look, if you have to pick between your parents or me, the choice is easy. 100% of every time, you always pick me. And then he ramps up the difficulty of this conversation. He says, and whoever loves son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. Now, Jesus, now you're going after my son and my daughter? Now, if you have kids, you understand why this is such a difficult teaching. Because you know when you held your daughter in your arms for the first time, when you held your son in your arms for the first time, or you watched them go through the stages of life, right? They begin to crawl and walk, and you just marveled at it. And you thought, how could God love me enough to give me this gift? How could he trust me enough to have this child to watch over and to raise? And you fell in love with them in a deeper way than you've never cared for anything in your entire life. This is your son. This is your daughter. And Jesus says, look, if you have to pick between that most intimate of relationship, your son or your daughter, and me, you pick me every time. Then he goes on and makes it even more difficult for us. And whoever does not take up the cross and follow me is not worthy of me. You see, what he's talking about now he's talking about everything in life. Because he uses this word cross. Now, as Christians, if we've been in church for a while and we kind of know the whole story, right, the whole historical story, when we hear cross, we think of Jesus. We think of Jesus living the perfect life, right? He's falsely accused, gets put on the cross, dies for our sin, and then he rises from the dead, right? We get that. That's the story. So when we hear the word cross, that's what we think about. But when these disciples heard the word cross in this moment, that's not what they heard, because they hadn't experienced that yet. That was yet to come in their story. You see, when they heard the word cross, all they heard was death. And not just death, but picking up your cross means you're choosing to die, which means what Jesus is saying is, look, if you have to choose between me and everything else, you have to pick me. Everything else is my parents, my spouse, my kids, everything, even including my politics. And so Jesus, he closes with this. Those who find their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake will find it. You see, he ends with the good news. He ends with the gospel. The good news is this: he has a better way for us. He says you can go do your own thing, you can pursue your own things, and you can build your life exactly how you think it should be or what's going to bring you happiness, but guess what happens? You're never quite satisfied. You never quite feel that joy. You're never quite happy, and you just keep pursuing and pursuing and pursuing and pursuing. And in the end, you find nothing, even though you feel like you've gained the whole world. But the good news is this. Jesus says, look, if you put me on the throne of your heart, if you let me be king, you're going to lose all your dreams. You're going to lose everything that you thought this world should be. But instead, you're going to gain absolutely everything. You're going to gain exactly what you never thought you were looking for and experience everything that you've wanted to experience. So today, on this 4th of July weekend, can we just get political here just for a second? And right now you're thinking, yep, I knew it was going to go here. Right? I knew this was the time when he was going to tell us, hey, look, if you want to be a follower of Christ, you have to vote Republican. You have to vote red. Or this is the time when the pastor says, look, if you want to be a follower of Christ, you have to vote Democratic. You have to be a Democrat, and you have to vote blue. Right? This is the time when he outs himself, when he tells us exactly what we should do. And the reason you're thinking that is because that's kind of what the world thinks about Christians. You see, when we unmask the reality of how the world sees the church, what they see is that it's political. Because they found themselves in church at some point in time where the church just had this underlying tension that if you were a true Christian, a true follower of Christ, then you had to be Republican. And because they weren't, they didn't quite fit in. They didn't feel accepted. Or maybe they went to a church and you had to be a Democrat. You had to. That was what everyone was in that church, and if you weren't, then you were not a loving follower of Christ. Right? And they felt that tension. Or maybe the pastor got up, and in part of his sermon, or maybe the whole sermon, he spent the entire time endorsing a political candidate of his choosing. Right? And they went to that and they thought, this is so political. Or maybe they were at a church who always hosted political candidates in their gym or their meeting room or whatever. And they started noticing that all of the political candidates that this church hosted was all on one side of the aisle. And they thought, it's all political. Can you see how this would get in the way of reaching people for the cause of Christ? As soon as you pick a side and you say, Christians are this, or the church is this, or the church has to be this, that you alienate 50% of the people that Jesus is trying to reach with his transforming truth. But here's the thing. Here's the thing. Sometimes churches can feel political, but this is what we're supposed to be. They might feel political, but really what we're supposed to be, it should not be political party. It should not be political party. Because as Christians, we're not called to vote red. And we're not called to vote blue. You see, we are called to vote gold every time. Because it's Christ who sits on the throne. It's Christ who should sit on the throne of our hearts. Which means this: if Jesus conflicts with our political ideologies, we should conflict with our political ideologies. And isn't that freeing? I mean, isn't that true freedom? That we don't have to attach ourselves to a political party. We don't have to attach ourselves to some sort of political entity like a president or senator or representative, right? We don't have to do that, which frees us up when they run in a direction that we don't feel comfortable with. We don't have to run along with them. We're not attached to that. You see, as Christians, we don't attach ourselves to a donkey. We don't attach ourselves to an elephant. But what we do attach ourselves to, time and time and time again, is a lamb. Let's pray.